Chalk and cheese. If you bit on a piece of chalk and then you bit on a piece of cheese after you washed out your mouth, obviously you notice the difference. Huge difference. Now currently we're looking at the significant differences between the Whitlam-led Labor government, which is in power from the 5th of December 1972 to the 11th of November 1975, and the Albanese-led Labor government. Now I'll spend 95% of the time looking at the reform initiatives which were passed by the Whitlam-led Labor government in comparison to the minute or so I'll spend looking at the Albanese Labor government's record. Considering that the Albanese Labor government has been in power for over 1,000 days, and considering that the Whitlam Labor government was in power for 1,061 days, it highlights the differences that existed 50 years ago in comparison to today. Now, to give you a little bit of background, the Chifley Labor government was defeated in 1949 by the newly formed Liberal Country Party coalition, and they held power for 23 years till 1972, and most of the time that they were in power, all of the time they were in power, they were elected and re-elected on the program of fear of the yellow hordes from China and Vietnam invading Australia, and fear of the communist menace. So election after the election, Australians voted for the Liberal Country Party. Now the Country Party was the forerunner of today's National Party, but unlike the agri-business party which the National Party has become, the Country Party did tend to look after the interests of country people, and many people thought of it as a socialist agrarian movement. But getting back to the matter at hand, in 1960 Gough Whitlam was elected as the deputy head of the Australian Labor Party, and in 1967, after the Labor Party's drubbing at the 1966 election, Arthur Calwell resigned and Gough Whitlam took over the party. At the 1969 election, the ALP, led by Gough Whitlam, came within four seats of unseating the Gorton Liberal Country Party coalition. So the scene was set in 1972 for a historic election. Now there was a great deal of pressure from the sections of the Australian society for significant reforms. And this is what drove the Labor Party, the branches of the Australian Labor Party. This push from below for significant reforms which had been pent up for the past 23 years, as the Liberal Country Party continued on its pro-British, anti-communist, yellow horde trajectory. Now obviously the Vietnam War, conscription, and Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, and the fact that conscripts were sent to Vietnam, caused a lot of dissension There were protests, sit-ins, draft resistors were being jailed, and the list goes on and on. The universities were in turmoil pre-1972, and the trade union movement was demanding better wages and conditions for its workers. And in those days, the trade unions' membership had reached almost 60% of the working population in comparison to the 10% today, and 80% of that 10% is made up by public sector workers today in 2025. So there's this great push for change. There's push for change from an emerging black movement, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander movement. There was push for change for migrants who had for far too long been ostracised and marginalised and humiliated. There was push for change, for social change in terms of pensions, in terms of government support, in terms of public education. So there are all these pressures placed on the parliamentary system to bring about reforms. And those of you who were alive during the 1972 election, which was held in early December 1972, remember the "It's Time" slogan, which was successfully used by the Australian Labor Party to oust the McMahon-led Liberal Country Party coalition. Now, Gough Whitlam and the Deputy, Lance Bernard, were very keen to begin that reform agenda. They had a majority of 7 seats in the House of Representatives, and in the 60-person Senate, they didn't have a majority. At that particular point in time, I think both major parties had an equal number of senators. I think it was 29 each, and there were 2 independents which had a right-wing agenda. So as soon as it became clear, and before Parliament was even reconvened, Gough Whitlam and Lance Bernard began to implement social changes which are about redistributing wealth and about reshaping Australia's position in the world. In those first few weeks before Parliament was convened, they were able to pass certain reforms which didn't need parliamentary legislation. Lance Bernard, the Defence Minister, had the ability to create exemptions under the Defence Ministry regarding the conscription. So he exempted every Australian. This led to the release of 7 draft resistors who are currently in jail. Although the McMahon government had pulled out most of the Australian troops from Vietnam, including all conscripts, all troops were pulled out of Vietnam in 1972. Gough Whitlam, as leader of the opposition, had visited Mao Zedong's China in 1971, and in 1972, as soon as they were elected, they formalised their relationships with China and no longer recognised Taiwan. As far as apartheid was concerned, South Africa and Rhodesia sanctions were placed on South Africa and Rhodesia because of their apartheid policies, and all sporting teams which were based on racial selection were also banned from this country. And those of you that are old enough will remember all the protests concerned the Springboks when they came to Australia in the early 1970s, and the police riot in Queensland, in Brisbane in 1971, which led to the hospitalisation of many, many anti-apartheid protesters. At the same time, in those first few heady weeks, tariffs were removed from contraceptions. An interim school commission was set up to look at the public education sector from tertiary to preschool. When Parliament was convened in 1973, we saw a rash of legislation because the push from below, from the Australian people, was for change. And the Labor Party, although it did not have a majority in the Senate, and only 7-seat majority, unlike the current ALP, which has a historic majority of I think almost 25-30 seats, and also a very, very friendly Senate where the Greens hold the balance of power. So it pushed on. The Whitlam-led Labor government pushed on with its radical reform agenda, which was about redistributing wealth. And I'll go through the different groups which were affected. Obviously, as far as defence was concerned, conscription was ended. The Vietnam conflict was no longer a matter for Australia. Reforms were introduced into the rehabilitation and repatriation scheme. All soldiers who'd fought in World War I, the Boer War, and were prisoners of war were granted free private and public care in the health system. The Defence Loans program was expanded to include any serviceman or woman who had served for more than 3 years. There was no longer a provision they needed to serve overseas before they had priority assistance with housing. There were major changes to the rehabilitation system in order to continue to provide medical care for defence personnel. Because although the Liberal Country Party coalition banged on about the importance of servicemen and servicewomen, they did little to look after the needs of the injured and their families once they returned to this country. As far as agriculture is concerned, extraordinary things happened during those 3 years. Farm income tripled. At the same time, tariffs were reduced on farm equipment. And the relationship with China and Australia's anti-South African and Rhodesia position improved its trading position internationally. And exports from this country boomed. As I said before, farming incomes tripled during that period. There are also regional urban development programs which are instituted. As far as roads were concerned, the federal government began to become involved in the provision of services which should be provided by state governments. And at that particular point in time, the New South Wales government, the Victorian government, the Queensland government, the South Australian government and the West Australian government are all controlled by hostile Liberal Country Party governments. So what the Whitlam-led Labor government did is it bypassed the states and directly financed local authorities. Now, what had happened between 1949 and 1972 as far as the poorer sections of Australian society was concerned? Nothing. We had inner city suburbs which didn't even have sewerage. We had different railway gauges for different states. So the federal government bypassed the state apparatus and, as I said before, funded local authorities, flood mitigation, sewerage, common railway gauge for the whole country, footpaths, lighting, essential infrastructure which poorer sections of Australian society had been starved of for the last 23 years. As far as education is concerned, major reforms. Tertiary education became free. What we saw was an emphasis on technical education and the formation of new federal government bodies to assist the expansion of technical education. We saw the amount of money allocated to state schools, public schools, especially the 1,000 poorest, increased almost threefold, as well as money to the private schools will increase twofold. We saw push to introduce alternative education, with specific grants being given to different groups to trial new forms of education. When you look at the health sector, this is where most of the major reforms occurred, or many of the major reforms. Believe it or not, apart from Queensland, which had a 3 understaffed, underfunded public health system, to access health care in 1972, between World War II and 1972, cost people money. So many poorer people didn't access public health care because they didn't have the resources to access public health care. And they didn't even access private doctors because they didn't have the resources to access private doctors. The Whitlam-led Labor government introduced Medibank, a universal health insurance scheme which included all Australians. It wasn't until 1974, after a double dissolution election, which meant that all the senators were up for re-election and all the House of Representatives seats were up for re-election, when the Whitlam-led Labor government obtained 49.3% of the vote, that Medibank was able to be introduced despite widespread opposition from every major medical faculty and organisation in this country who saw it as the death of private medicine. We saw as I said before, we saw money set up for community health centres. Different community groups could get grants to set up community health centres. We saw money allocated for mental health services, for services regarding women's refuges. As far as equality is concerned, the Whitlam Labor government passed legislation, the Racial Discrimination Act, to finally bury the White Australia policy. It supported equal pay for equal work for women, and appointed Evatt as the commissioner. It was heavily involved in the International Women's Year in 1975. It funded refuges. It expanded the social security system to include all those people that had been exempted. The only women able to acquire a pension outside an old age pension, or what was called an invalid pension, were widows, single mothers, single fathers, people in de facto relationships were not eligible for anything until the maternity allowance was introduced. And this changed the dynamic where single mothers in a pre-contraceptive era were forced to adopt their children because they didn't actually have the resources, the financial resources. The maternity benefit allowance allowed them to keep their children. And the list goes on and on. As I said, as far as legal sector is concerned, we saw the introduction of legal aid centres. We saw the introduction of no-fault divorce, the first in the world. We saw the introduction of the abolition of the death penalty for federal crimes. We saw many issues. As far as trade unions is concerned, the ALP was concerned about the fact that the rank and file had been cut out of the trade union movement. They passed legislation to ensure there were free and fair union elections, that rank and file members controlled their union. As far as wages is concerned, there was a 30% increase in wages. The introduction of leave loading, which meant that if you went on leave for 4 weeks, you got a 17.5% loading on that leave, so you could actually enjoy, you had the resources to enjoy a break, a holiday. As far as federal public servants were concerned, we saw the introduction of a 36.25-hour week, maternity allowances for 6 weeks, paternity allowance for 1 week, rapid increase in wages. And as far as pensions were concerned, we saw an 80% increase in the old age pension for a single pensioner and a 70% increase for a married couple. We saw huge changes in culture. At that particular point in time, people felt they had to go to Britain or America to pursue an artistic career. We saw the formation of the Australian Film Foundation, the Australian of the National Art Gallery in Canberra, the purchase of the blue poles made by Jackson Pollocks in 1972. We saw the introduction of many, many cultural changes. And for the first time since colonisation began in 1788, we saw a federal government taking a very close interest in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, with the introduction of an electoral system which elected people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives, to advise the government. We saw the introduction of a land rights bill and land rights in the ACT, and more importantly in the Northern Territory. We saw housing developments around the country, not just in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. We even saw the beginning of education in Aboriginal people's traditional languages on their traditional homelands. Huge number of changes as far as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were concerned. So this is a government that in 1,061 days passed more than 400 pieces of reform legislation, despite the oil crisis in 1973, despite increasing inflation, despite increasing unemployment, despite internal bickerings in the ALP, despite the shortcomings of a number of their ministers. We saw a Royal Commission into ASIO. We saw a Royal Commission into human relationships. We saw a series of referendums where the Whitlam-led Labor government attempted to forever change this country. A number of those that failed was their push to have local governments recognised as a separate entity, not creatures of state government, so they could actually fund local governments. We saw the creation of migrant centres, community houses, community hubs, all funded by the federal government. The creation of language, migrant language radio stations. We saw the creation of community radio stations around the country where licences were granted to community groups to create their own community radio stations in an attempt to counter the stifling conservatism of the Murdoch-owned media. So in 1,061 days we saw an extraordinary number of reforms, and most of those reforms continue to play a significant part in Australian history. When you look at the record of the Albanese Labor government, or led Labor government, you understand the differences. The Whitlam-led Labor government was a government which was pushed from below to create reforms to redistribute wealth. The Albanese Labor government is a government which doesn't govern for its constituents, which is too frightened. So in order to celebrate the 11th of November, the 50th anniversary of the legal dismissal of the Whitlam-led Labor government because of its hostility to United States foreign policy, and because it wanted more of this country's resources to be placed in the hands of Australian companies, and more importantly, it wanted the money that was made from these resources to be distributed among Australians, not among just majority shareholders. So in order to celebrate this 50 years, I encourage you to organise events everywhere in Australia for the 11th of November 1975. As far as we are concerned, public interest before corporate interest will be holding a picnic, that's right, to which you are invited at midday on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House. Tuesday, the 11th of November, midday. Bring food, drinks, musical instrument, yourself, your friends, take the day off work to celebrate the many reforms which were initiated in that heady 1061 days.